Moving on now to Psalm 142, a maskil of David while he was in the cave, a prayer. I cry aloud to the Lord. I appeal to the Lord loudly for mercy. I pour out my complaint before him. I lay my trouble before him when my spirit fails within me. You know my course. They have laid a trap in the path I walk. Look at my right and see, I have no friend. There is nowhere I can flee. No one cares about me. So I cry to you, O Lord. I say, you are my refuge, all I have in the land of the living. Listen to my cry, for I have been brought very low. Save me from my pursuers, for they are too strong for me. Free me from my prison, that I may praise your name. The righteous shall glory in me for your gracious dealings with me. A little bit about the context of this psalm. It begins with a reference to the cave, and the cave referred to here is described in the story in the first book of Samuel, chapter 24. This was before David became king, but he was already anointed king by Samuel, but Saul remained on the throne until his death. And Saul, because he was suffering from mental illness, extreme paranoia, and depression, pursued David with the intent to kill him because he was afraid that David would take his throne from underneath him. And so, in this particular story, Saul learns that David is hiding with his small retinue of men in the wilderness of En Gedi, which is in the middle of the Judean desert, south of Jerusalem. And Saul assembles an army of 3,000 men to go to En Gedi to pursue David. Once he arrives there, he ducks into a cave, Saul that is, in order to relieve himself. Meanwhile, David is sitting inside the cave with his men, and they notice Saul standing there alone in the cave, and David's men urge David to kill Saul in order to get Saul off of his back so that David will be safe. Instead of doing that, David very stealthily creeps up behind Saul while he is relieving himself and takes a knife and cuts a piece from Saul's cloak. After Saul leaves the cave, David then pursues Saul, calls out to him, and shows him that piece of cloak, and reminds Saul that even though David's men wanted him to kill Saul, David refused because he told his men that he must not lay a hand against the Lord's anointed. And even though by this time Saul had lost the divine right of kingship because of the incident with the Amalekites, and I'm not going to get into that right now, but suffice it to say that Saul disobeyed the word of the Lord in that incident, and the Lord, through the prophet Samuel, stripped Saul of his kingship. But Saul continued to occupy the throne nevertheless. David is ever conscious of Saul's stature and status as having once been anointed by Samuel as king of Israel, and he refuses to do any harm to King Saul. And so, getting back to our story, once David shows Saul that piece of cloak as proof that he had had the opportunity to kill Saul while Saul was in the cave, but he refused because he would not lift a hand against the Lord's anointed. Upon hearing this, Saul breaks down and weeps, snaps out, at least momentarily, from his paranoia and his illness and is able to see David for who he really is. And he feels very deep remorse for having pursued David in order to kill him. The psalmist here, relating to King David, is talking about what it feels like to be pursued. His enemies lay a trap for him in the path that he walks. He feels that there is nowhere that he can flee. He feels that no one cares about him, with the exception of God. He turns back to God and says, "Listen to my cry. I've been brought low. Save me from my pursuers. Free me from prison, that I may praise your name." And then the conclusion of the psalm, "The righteous shall glory in me for your gracious dealings with me." The psalmist has faith and trust that God will rescue him and deliver him, and that God will do this out of God's gracious compassion for the one who is being pursued. In reality, in the Bible story, David really is the one who had the upper hand. He could have killed Saul, and Saul has already realized that he has lost the divine right of kingship. And yet, even though David knows that he has the upper hand in this particular incident, he is also aware that Saul continues to set out to kill him, and that Saul has the numbers on his side. He has the armies of Israel on his side. Isn't it true in our own lives that we sometimes imagine that we are being pursued, when really we have a sense of power deep within, but that sense may be somewhat remote or inaccessible because our fears and our anxieties gain the upper hand? If we could only put those anxieties aside and find a connection with that deep spiritual power within, and realize that though we may feel that we are being pursued, in reality, we, out of our own strength, can take some measure of control over our fate, that we have the power, through God's help and through God's wisdom, to make the right choices in our lives that can affect not only ourselves but others around us in a positive way. So let's try to get out of that idea that we are always being pursued or chased, that we are always in danger, that we are always in a situation of losing control over our destiny. True, there are forces outside of us that may imperil us, that may threaten us with loss of control and freedom in our lives. But knowing that, even when we feel that those threats are real, we have a choice to do something about it, to speak out, to make our voices heard. In the case of the current election season, to exercise the right to vote, to make our voices and opinions known freely out of an awareness that we live in a free country where freedom of speech is supposed to be guaranteed to us. Let us not fear, but rather let us hope, and let us understand that even though we may feel chased and pursued, in reality, we have great power, we have great measure of control, as long as we keep God straight and in front of our eyes and in our hearts at all times. That awareness of God's presence is what will see us through, even during difficult times such as these. Thank you.